What if love is less a feeling and more a question we keep asking ourselves? The first time you fell for someone you believed you understood love, and yet the question remained pressing and unresolved. The uncertainty of love can feel like a beautiful trap or a dangerous mirage depending on the hour and the mood we bring. This video begins with a simple promise that philosophy will not hand you romance like a recipe, and instead will offer maps for navigation through taste, pain, and longing. We will look at ancient dialogues, meditative practices, and modern existential dilemmas to see how thinkers have tried to make sense of the force that pulls people together and tears them apart. Plato invites us into a crowded room where words are weapons and words are solace at once. In the Symposium, each speaker unwraps love like a gift and like a riddle, showing us that eros has many faces and many consequences. When we read Plato, we discover that love can pull us toward beauty and also toward wisdom. And that desire often disguises itself as longing for something higher than the self. The dialogue teaches that love is not merely sexual attraction, but a ladder leading from physical admiration to knowledge of the eternal forms. One of the Symposium voices, Aristophanes, tells a myth about human halves that once were whole, and that story wraps longing in gentle humor. He claims lovers are two halves seeking reunion, creating a narrative that gives longing a cosmic purpose and an almost tragic sweetness. This myth frames love as completion rather than consumption, and it helps explain why many relationships feel like restoration or rescue. By the time you finish the tale, you understand why people will risk everything to feel whole again, or to recover a missing echo of themselves. Socrates, speaking through Diotima, gives a cooler, more ambitious interpretation of desire that moves beyond bodies toward beauty itself. Love becomes a ladder of ascent where physical attraction leads to appreciation for minds, then laws, then the eternal idea of beauty and truth. This ascent reframes relationships as educational, not merely emotional, suggesting that true partnership cultivates mutual growth and shared pursuit of higher things. When we see love as a guiding force toward wisdom, relationships inherit a philosophical purpose that changes how we measure success and failure together. But Plato is not the only voice we need to hear, because love can also be a source of deep suffering when attachment becomes clinging. Buddhism gives us a starkly pragmatic perspective that cuts through romanticism to ask a difficult question. Why does attachment cause suffering so often? Buddhist teachings do not outlaw love or connection, but they point out that craving and grasping make relationships fragile and painful. By examining desire as a mental process, Buddhism offers strategies to engage with love more skillfully and less destructively. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from wanting and clinging, and that attachments distort perception and create endless expectation. When we demand permanence from something inherently impermanent, disappointment becomes inevitable and repeated like a ritual. This perspective reframes breakup not as failure but as proof of life's transient nature, and it teaches that the antidote to suffering is not indifference but mindful engagement without grasp. Practicing non-attachment does not mean withdrawing from love, but it does mean loving with open hands and honest presence. If Buddhism emphasizes release, existentialism emphasizes authenticity, and that change in focus brings relationships into a spotlight of freedom and responsibility. Existentialists ask whether our connections are chosen freely and whether they enable true self-expression or simply become stage props for social expectations. Sartre famously argued that we often treat others as objects, a concept that makes intimacy frightening because a partner can become a mirror or a jailer. Authentic relationships for existentialists are rare and demanding, requiring radical honesty and acceptance of mutual freedom. Existentialists insist that freedom is terrifying, yet without it there can be no genuine love because love forced into roles cannot be authentic. If you love someone only because society expects it, you are loving a caricature of yourself rather than living truth. This philosophical stance forces a hard conversation about dependency and expectations. Because authentic love requires both partners to own themselves and their choices. The brave work of existential love is to remain fully oneself, while inviting the other to do the same. From Plato to Buddhism to existentialism, we arrive at a paradox that sits at the heart of almost every relationship: the tension between need and freedom. Love asks us to want someone and to let that person remain free, which creates a constant negotiation of boundaries and closeness. When need becomes dependence, it corrodes autonomy. And when freedom becomes aloofness, it destroys intimacy, which means healthy love must be a delicate balancing act. Understanding this paradox is less about solving it and more about learning how to live with it constructively. Psychology offers tools to decode patterns that philosophy names, and attachment theory shows how early relationships echo into adult love affairs. Our childhood attachments can shape the muscle memory of intimacy, making security or anxiety familiar responses later in life. Recognizing those patterns is not a sentence, but an opportunity, because insight allows us to choose different behaviors and to partner more intentionally. Philosophy and psychology together provide both the map and the method for change, blending meaning with practical technique. So how might ancient wisdom and modern science actually improve our relationships in practical ways that feel tangible and humane? First, we can practice seeing love as a skill that grows from attention, not an unstable emotion that randomly appears and disappears. Daily practices such as mindful listening, deliberate gratitude, and honest communication become exercises that strengthen connection over time. When love is practiced as a habit, it withstands storms more reliably than moments of spontaneous passion ever could. Plato's ladder can become a relationship curriculum if partners intentionally pursue shared growth and mutual learning through life. When you commit to learning together, small disagreements turn into philosophical experiments instead of existential threats. That kind of partnership resembles a laboratory where both people test assumptions, revise behaviors, and celebrate incremental progress. Viewing relationships as collaborative inquiry diffuses blame and cultivates curiosity, which is often the most underrated ingredient of longevity. Buddhist practices translate into relationships through the cultivation of presence, compassion, and non-attachment to outcomes that often create surprising resilience. When partners accept impermanence, they can appreciate each moment more fully, and the fear of loss diminishes without lessening love. This does not mean detachment from commitment, but it reframes commitment as an ongoing choice rather than a contractual ownership. The result is a steadier love that can adapt to change because its foundation is presence and intention rather than fear. Existential honesty in relationships looks less like brutal truth-telling and more like courageous vulnerability that honors autonomy and responsibility at once. Saying the difficult things gracefully allows partners to make informed choices and create space for deeper trust over time. This practice of candid tenderness requires both discipline and empathy, and it rewards relationships with authenticity that nothing else can substitute. By continually choosing to reveal rather than to perform, couples generate a rare form of intimacy that sustains rather than suffocates. There is a political dimension to love that philosophers often explore, because relationships exist inside cultures that tell us how to love and whom to love. Norms, laws, and economies influence whether people can pursue connection freely or whether love is commodified and constrained. Noticing the social scaffolding around relationships helps us understand that personal problems are frequently political problems in disguise. When partners consider their relationship as part of a wider social fabric, choices become not only personal, but also ethical and shared. The paradox of independence and interdependence turns into an ethic when couples negotiate how to be together while remaining whole. And that negotiation is a daily art. Healthy interdependence allows support without subsuming identity, and it requires both people to cultivate separate lives that intersect meaningfully. Practical habits like pursuing personal projects, maintaining friendships, and carving out private time strengthen the partnership by preventing enmeshment. Interdependence is not the opposite of autonomy. Rather, it is autonomy practiced in conversation and mutual care. Love as a practice reframes romance from a lucky spark into something trainable and improvable through repetition and reflection. We can deliberately plan acts of kindness, design rituals of appreciation, and build forgiveness muscles that outlast anger. This practical orientation makes relationship work less mysterious and more humane, because it replaces endless hoping with steady, intentional action. Practicing love does not drain magic from relationships. It amplifies the magic by giving it form and reliability. Philosophy also invites us to ask uncomfortable ethical questions about consent, power, and reciprocity within love, which are necessary for sustainable connection. A relationship built on unequal bargaining or unclear consent can never become an arena for genuine flourishing. Addressing power dynamics honestly allows partners to redistribute control and to create agreements that honor both people's needs. When relationships are constructed on ethical foundations, they generate trust and creativity rather than resentment and stagnation. Technology complicates love by amplifying both our capacity to connect and our capacity to avoid real intimacy with curated selves. Social media makes the performance of love into a spectacle, and dating apps commodify desire into algorithms that reward novelty over depth. Being philosophically literate about technology helps couples resist pressures to perform and instead prioritize offline practices that build presence. Choosing slower, quieter rituals over constant broadcasting can reclaim depth in relationships and preserve the inner life that social feeds tend to erode. Forgiveness emerges repeatedly across traditions as a practical necessity for long-term relationships, and philosophy gives it contours beyond vague platitudes and convenient apologies. Forgiveness is neither forgetting nor condoning. It is the difficult decision to remake trust through accountable change and new commitments. Good forgiveness requires boundaries, clear communication, and mutual accountability to prevent cycles of harm from repeating. When cultivated as a practiced ethic within a relationship, forgiveness becomes a pathway back to shared meaning rather than a slide into resigned acceptance. We should also remember that not every relationship is meant to last forever, which is a painful philosophical reminder that some loves teach and then depart. Transience does not invalidate the lessons and beauty that came from connection, and sometimes endings are the clearest acts of care. Accepting that some attachments will end asks us to love more fully in the present, rather than to cling to imagined permanence. This acceptance can free us to invest honestly and to leave gracefully when the relationship has reached its natural limit. If philosophy teaches anything about love, it is that ideas shape practices, and practices shape lives, and so the conversation must always move from abstract reflection to concrete habit. When we pair insight with intention, our relationships become laboratories for moral imagination and emotional competence. This pairing changes how we evaluate success in love, shifting from public milestones to private growth and resilient care. Measuring relationships by shared learning rather than by constant happiness creates a more generous and realistic standard for flourishing together. Ultimately, the philosophical journey through love and attachment lands on a paradoxical hope that is both humble and expansive, and that hope resembles practice more than prophecy. Loving well asks for courage to face our own shadows and generosity to hold the other's humanity without consuming it. This final insight reframes love as a cultivated art that requires discipline, empathy, and ongoing curiosity about the other person. When viewed this way, relationships become the primary schools for moral and emotional maturity, where both partners learn how to be human together. The philosophical twist is that attachment itself can be the vehicle for liberation when practiced wisely, turning what looks like bondage into a tool for freedom. By intentionally balancing desire with discernment, empathy with autonomy, and ritual with spontaneity, attachment can deepen rather than diminish our freedom. This paradox is the core lesson from every tradition we examined, and it reframes modern relationship struggles as opportunities for inner development, rather than mere emotional disasters. If we can learn to use attachment as a mirror for our own growth, then love becomes not a trap, but a path. So, what does this mean for you as a person living in a noisy, demanding world where relationships compete with careers and screens? It means that small disciplines matter enormously. Habits of attention, boundaries, and honest speech compound into deeper connection over years. It also means that failure is not the opposite of love, but often its teacher. And that tenderness can be forged through trials, rather than through uninterrupted comfort. Learning from failure and investing in practices that build mutual growth will strengthen bonds in a way that feeling alone never could. If this video leaves you with one concrete task, let it be this. Name one small practice you will try this week that invites presence into your relationship. It could be a nightly 5-minute listening ritual, a shared walk without phones, or a brief gratitude exchange before bed each night. Small practices accumulate into character, and character determines how love behaves under pressure rather than merely how it feels in good weather. Try to treat love as the steady practice it can be, and notice how your relationships begin to change in surprising ways. In closing, remember that philosophy does not give you the perfect formula for love, and that is its point rather than its failure. Instead, philosophy hands you tools to think clearly, to feel deeply, and to act courageously within relationships that are always more complicated than our best intentions. If this gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing to continue conversations about living more thoughtfully and loving more wisely. If this perspective changed how you see your relationships in even one small way, then the work of philosophy has done exactly what it intended to do.